All right, the next item on our agenda, let's see, agenda review. Wilson, that's yours.
But before we get started, I want to make sure that I've got the narrative on here. But can't see. All right. So we delivered an agenda packet to you on Friday, but I and I's first draft of a balanced budget. Now, based on the conversation today, of course, that might change, but I wanted to bring you something to at least talk about. So that's your big attachment, Appendix 1. The other appendices are supplementary materials that we use at various stages throughout the day. But first, I would like to go over the agenda. The first thing we'll do this morning is to review and clarify your priorities from our previous retreat. Those are the priorities we used when we were deciding what projects to fund. At the retreat, we didn't come up with sort of descriptions for each of those. And so I did based on my notes and based on my memory from the retreat. And so I'd like for us to go over those and clarify that those are indeed your expectations for those priorities. The second thing is I'd like to share with you the principles that Connie and I used when we were putting this budget together. There are some best practices. There are some things that municipal budget developers ought to do to make sure that they are being good stewards of the public's funds. And so I'd like to go over those with you as a group. After that, we'll dive into the water sewer budget, which interestingly enough, this year is probably the simpler of the two budgets. David's here to answer any questions. Dale will be here a little bit later on to answer any questions. But we'll go over their operational needs for the coming year. And then we'll also spend a few minutes talking about some of their needs for the years to come. All right, after that, I suspect that'll take us to lunchtime. So we'll stop and have lunch. And after lunch, we'll dive into the general fund budget. It's the more complicated of the two this year because it's made up of many more revenue sources, which we've talked briefly about before, are sort of at an inflection point. The pandemic has caused a big shakeup in our world, and so some of those revenue sources are less predictable than they used to be. So we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about what I'm calling the all-in budget. So this was the budget request that our department heads made, where they asked for anything they thought they needed or wanted. And I won't keep you in suspense. Needless to say, we couldn't afford that. But I did want to show it to you to show you what kind of stuff that includes. And so we'll go over that. But even though we couldn't afford all those things, that doesn't mean they weren't meritorious. And some of those things were related to the priorities that you shared at the retreat. And so we didn't want to cut those and forget about them. We wanted to see if we could make those happen. And as I've said before, this year has been an interesting year in terms of our cash. We've had a couple windfalls, the sale of our properties, the expected ARP money, and the offset from the CARES Act from earlier in the year. And so, as I've said, I think that there are some one-time expenses that we can use that cash to pay for. And so I recommend that we do that. And so at this stage in the meeting, we'll go over my proposal for what projects I propose we fund and what sources I propose we use for those projects. And if you take those projects out of the next year's budget and fund them with current year dollars, all of a sudden next year's budget becomes much more manageable. And so in section 10, we will go over the revised new year budget, and you'll see that it becomes much more manageable at that point. All right. And finally, and just as a reminder, this is not supposed to be a presentation by me or a lecture by me. This is supposed to be a conversation. And so if you feel the urge to stop me and talk about some other issue over the course of the proceedings today, that's fine. At the end of the day, we'll do an exercise that I call adds and deletes. So if there's something that is missing from the proposed budget that you want to add, this will be the opportunity. And I'll talk a little bit more when we get there, but just as food for thought throughout the day, to make this exercise effective, if you have an add, it's also helpful to have either a delete or a new revenue source. So if you're feeling the urge to add something, please be thinking about how we're going to pay for it before we get to this exercise in the afternoon. Depending on whether or not there's consensus, if someone comes up with an add and a delete, it balances and it makes sense to everyone, and I didn't sense there's a consensus in the room, then we'll add it. But if I don't feel a consensus, I'll probably ask you all to take votes on whether or not to include that proposal. So we'll just sort of play it by ear when we get there. And Connie will record those, and we'll try to find a way to insert those into the next draft of the budget. And then after that, we'll summarize and adjourn. So that's a quick summary. Anyone have any comments on the proceedings before we go forward? Let me see if Mary. I think she's on. Okay, there.
Do we have guests, Wilson?
No, ma'am, we've got the department heads on standby if we need them to contribute. I did ask someone from the water sewer fund to be here this morning just to answer any questions, but this afternoon when we get to the general fund, we'll have those folks ready to log on.
Actually, I'm speaking up on Zoom.
Oh, no, ma'am, I didn't see it.
I can't see that.
So we are being broadcast, and this is a public meeting, so just as a reminder. All right, so if you'll turn to the first page of your agenda, Roman numeral 4, review and clarify board priorities. So I remember when we were going through these at the retreat, we talked about what would be a reasonable accomplishment for one of them, and that was the water system. And so my recollection and my notes were that in the coming year, we would identify and pursue next steps to help protect water supply from drought. Pursue a water sharing MOU with Wilkesboro. Apply for state assistance to help us pay for an engineering assessment on how to physically and chemically connect the system. I guess my question for you all is that a reasonable expectation for that goal in the coming year? Yes. Okay. All right. Well, so the good news is that is reasonably affordable to do. If we aren't doing any of the actual physical reconfiguration in the coming year, then I think that one's something we can afford. I'll go ahead and share now that I think with the federal stimulus dollars that are about to start circulating in the economy, that there'll be a lot of opportunities for grants from the state and the feds to actually do those kind of connections. And so one of the things I'll add to this goal was to pursue grant opportunities. Okay, police fire facilities. What I've got as our goal for the year is to work to find an economical solution to replace or update the town's public safety facilities. Is that a reasonable expectation for everybody?
Can you explain what that means?
Well, so years ago when we had the group come in last time and give us the $9 million quote. I'd like to sort of get to that stage again, but with something that's much more affordable. So have a plan for a $4 or $5 million facility that we can then use to, hire a firm to do the blueprints, and that we can use to apply for grant money and so forth. So to take us to the stage, Andrew, where we can really start talking seriously about how to afford it and how to get it built. And you'll see later that even this stage will require a little bit of funding, but I've got a proposal on how to pay for it. All right, traffic calming. To come up with a plan to reduce traffic volumes and speeds on in-town streets, to test different traffic calming options, and, if possible, to install appropriate permanent traffic calming measures.
Yeah, that's,
Yes.
Yes.
All right, paving and stormwater are together just because they're both infrastructure related. Address infrastructure deficiencies in these two areas. Where possible, complete small projects to fix, maintain, or enhance the street and stormwater system.
Yes.
yeah,
Then finally, beautification and streetscapes. Identify small projects that make the town more physically attractive.
Yes.
You like that? So I'll give you an example of one. This might not be the kind of thing that people think of when they think of beautification, but I think our small project to move the dumpsters from behind the ABC store is a beautification project.
I do too. In fact, I thought they would already be gone.
We've been working out, to just as an aside, I actually got an email from Danny this morning on this matter. The agreement that they gave us didn't have any indemnification clauses for us. And then it also permitted them to sort of set the disposal rate unilaterally. And so we're still negotiating with them over the sort of intricacies of the contract. But we're working on it, and hopefully we'll be able to come to an agreement soon on that. But anyway, that's an example of a beautification project that we got done without much expenditures of resources. All right, so those are reasonable expectations for you all.
I like what you guys did. I didn't mean to interrupt, but down at the sign at the bottom of Secretary Hill, that really helps the look, I think. Stuff like that.
Yes, sir, that's the kind of stuff. All right, moving on to budgeting principles. So these are sort of the framework that we use to put the budget together. Part of these I sort of gleaned from the feedback that you all have shared with us over the last few months. Some of these are just industry best practices that municipal budgeters should follow. But like I said, these are the sort of guidelines that we use to put this draft together. So the first one is no tax increases. We haven't really talked about that, but I just get the sense from you all that you're not really interested in raising taxes. I haven't heard one person make a comment that they want to do that. So that was the #1 budgeting principle to follow. The second is not to use one-time revenues for continuing expenses. The exception would be the CARES and the ARP money, particularly the ARP money. Because the ARP money is intended to replace revenue that you lost from the pandemic. And so presumably at some point you'll get that revenue back. But still, you got to be careful about using that one-time money for things that are going to continue on. And so we were very conscientious about how we use that money. 3, we got to comply with the requirements of the CARES and ARP dollars. Now, the ARP dollars are probably going to come with few strings, but we don't quite know that yet. If you think back to the ARRA stimulus dollars a dozen years ago, they were distributed from Congress out to the federal agencies. And each federal agency had its own set of requirements for how you spent the money, reported the money, etc. And so this ARPA money is so new that those reporting requirements and those eligibility requirements haven't really come out yet. And so if we're going to budget ARP and CARES dollars, it's with the caveat that the thing we want to fund is eligible. With that said, the only ARP money that we've actually budgeted so far is the revenue replacement dollars. So we feel like the stuff we budgeted for is eligible for those dollars. To not budget fund balance, but instead appropriate it as needed. The LGC doesn't look favorably upon using your fund balance to balance your budget. But they know, and everyone knows, that sometimes you got to use it. And so we want to use it as needed. We want to keep it in that rainy day fund until we need it, and appropriate it then. So what that means is we get halfway through the year and discover that we need to use it for something. And I'm actually going to propose that we use some of it, but following these sort of procedural steps. We'll appropriate only the amount we need then, as opposed to budgeting it now.
So Wilson, will we then be adding some back at the end of the 21-22 year?
Well, presumably, yes. I mean, the last few years we've brought in more than we've spent, and so we have built a fund balance. So yes, presumably we will.
Do we ever find a number of that percentage that we want to try to meet and stay at?
Not yet, but the working number I'm using for now is 80%.
Okay.
And of course, that's up to you all, and I'll bring back the fund balance policy later on, and we'll include that information. But I might find that our peer cities are only doing 75, in which case it'll be up to you all to decide.
So then we do 76, just to show
Yeah,
them.
that's right. We could do that. Okay, and this is what I alluded to earlier. Where possible, pay for expenses with reserve funds in the current year rather than budgeting them in the new fiscal year. And then finally, budget a contingency if possible. So having a contingency fund in your budget oftentimes prevents the need to budget those fund balance funds. The more those can stay in your rainy day fund off to the side and be untouched, the better you are. And so it makes sense to have a budgeted contingency that you can use for unanticipated expenses rather than dip it into the rainy day fund. So if possible, budget. Do those make sense? Does anyone need any more explanation on any of those? Connie, you got anything there? Okay. All right, we're ready to move on. Let's move on to water sewer budget then. And I'll ask you to take out your big appendix here. Current page 37. And thanks to Connie for putting these together. They're, in my opinion, very clear and legible and helpful for this discussion. So the water sewer fund has a couple of different sources of revenue, but with the exception of our water rates, those sources of revenue account for a nominal amount of the total. The sort of only revenue source that matters in that fund is what we bring in from the sale of water. We raised our rates 2% on in-town customers last year and 9 cents on our wholesale customers. And I'm glad we did because the pandemic has really thrown utility collections up in the air. We've been talking about it a little bit throughout the year, about how there was the moratorium on cutoffs and about how during the stay at home, the big water users, the big customers were not in operation. So they weren't using water and paying for it. And then there was probably some other sort of vicissitudes in the pandemic year that caused people's water consumption to change. And so that's my long-winded way of saying that instead of being able to save some money this year the rate increases from last year kept us out of the red, but barely. So we weren't able to sock away money like we were hoping for, but we were able to stay more or less in the black. Because we don't know when the economy is going to recover and when things are going to go back to normal, we budgeted a modest increase. But again, not enough to be able to put money away. We have appropriated some of the expected ARP money to the water sewer fund to build that contingency. So if we didn't have that ARP money, we'd be able to break even. The ARP money will give us a little bit of cushion in the water and sewer fund. And if at the end of the year it's not spent, then it'll go back into the capital reserve funds so that we can pay for our other projects down the road. I want to go through the budget before we talk about the rates again. So if you'll start thumbing through, I'll go through the highlights here. Moving on to page 39 and 40. 40 is where the real stuff starts. Oh, excuse me. Yes. Lost my spot. No, there we go. 42. One theme that you'll hear today a lot is that one of the costs that we can't control, but that we have to pay, that goes up a little bit every year, is the cost of insurance for our employees. So Connie is negotiating that now, but we presume there will be an increase every year. We budgeted a 10% increase. It might be less than that. In fact, it's looking favorable. That's going to be less than that. But we budget that much of an increase just to make sure we have our bases covered. And this year, we're expecting it to be a little higher because, again, the pandemic has caused a lot of claims against medical insurance. It's sort of changed the actuarial assumptions that insurers use to calculate their rates. So we expect that it'll be a notable increase in that cost this year. And so already that's eaten into some of our capacity to fund other projects because we have to pay more to insure our employees. So that starts here as you look at the utility billing budget on page 42. You'll see that the insurance figure is higher than the previous year. No real notable changes in the utility billing section on page 42. We'll come over to page 46. You'll see that the per Scott debt expense. This will be the last year for that, which is good because we'll have some more capital expenses to pay for next year, as you'll see in a minute. We budgeted at the full $313,572. Remember that Wilkesboro pays for half of that, and so if you flip back to the revenue page, you can see 160-some thousand in revenue from Wilkesboro. And Connie tells me that she thinks since this is the last payment, it'll actually be less than that. So we might have a little cushion like that. All right.
Wilson,
Yes, ma'am.
on this $55,000 for dredging,
Mhm.
is that a major project, or is that just the ongoing, trying to keep the silt away from the water intake?
David, could you help us with that? That's the ongoing thing that we try to do every year to keep the silt out away from the intake so we can get water.
Was there any, but, I mean, there was no dredging done at all last year, correct?
No, that was not.
I'm gonna have to do kind of a catch-up kind of thing this year.
Right now, they're getting a lot out up the river there around the bend, and hopefully not, because we drained the dam the other day and got a bunch out ourselves. So we're just in a waiting pattern to see what we need to do for next year.
Do we ever contact any of the asphalt companies to see if they would, because I know upriver they have collection for the sand out of that river that they use, and I mean, I at one time was getting, it was pittance, but it was at least something. So is there, have we ever contacted any, like Carl Rose and Sons or anything about removal? Because I know dredging is one expense, but you also have the removal of the material that you, has there ever been any consideration to contact them to see if they would remove it once we take it out of the river?
We have talked to Tar Heel Sand and Stone, and they have come and tested the river, and they say there's too much sediment in there, in with the sand,
Okay.
to do any good, to get any kind of markable sand out of the river. So you'll turn to page 48, you'll see one of the capital improvement items included in the budget here. And that is the replacement of a couple utility trucks for the water and sewer department. Staff and I are still working out what the best means for acquiring those trucks will be, whether we want to straight out purchase them and use our one-term funds, or if we want to lease them and make the yearly payments much smaller and more manageable. There are benefits to doing each. We're still working that out. So when we come back with the draft budget, we'll have settled on one method or the other for that.
I don't believe we've ever leased before, have we?
No,
That's
ma'am.
kind of an interesting
I
concept.
don't think we have any.
We did police cars one time. Police
Yeah,
cars.
that, the police
One time.
department does it, yeah.
Sounds
been a
like
long
a good idea. I'm glad you're looking at it.
So we're still debating that one. We'll come back with a recommendation. Okay, repeat thumb through. David, is there anything else here in this operating budget you want to shine a spotlight on? No, that's about it. All right, so if you'll turn to page 52, then you'll see the bottom line there. You'll notice that we have a $261,561 contingency for the water and sewer fund. This is by and large the amount of ARP funds we have appropriated to that budget, plus the savings from buying the trucks as opposed to leasing them. If we buy them outright, we're going to spend $90,000. If we lease, we're going to spend 15 or something. So whatever that difference is, plus the ARC funds, sums up to this $261,000 contingency. If we conclude that buying them outright is the better option, then that'll fall to 170-some thousand, but it'll still be a healthy contingency for the water sewer fund.
What has our lifespan been on our prior trucks we have?
Most of the time we're getting 10, 15 years out of the truck. The one that we're replacing is a 99. It's starting to give trouble and in need of replacing. But usually 10, 15 years. one of the benefits of the lease, and again, we're still working on this, doing some analysis, is that it keeps you in new trucks, more frequently than every 15 years. So you don't have to, your maintenance costs, if you place many of your vehicles with leased vehicles and are replacing them every 4 years, your maintenance cost goes down. And so it actually helps you save money in that sense. But again, no conclusive information on this yet. We're still working through that, but that's one of the small changes that might be made in the next track. All right, so we did appropriate 30% of our expected ARP money to the water and sewer fund. Water and sewer projects, as well as revenue replacement, are eligible expenses. Oops. We did lose a bit of revenue from the water and sewer fund because we do have some investments, some money that from that fund that we invest. So between those two eligibility factors, we think that it's appropriate to budget that money into the water and sewer fund, and hopefully not need it, and we'll be able to use it for something else in the years to come. So that's a quick and dirty overview of the operational budget for the water and sewer fund for the coming year.
Well, so there's a lot of lines there, because I know with the last year, Tony, how much delinquency fund do we have currently?
Well, we began to turn water off again, so it's picking back up, but some have actually moved out and left us with some fairly large bills. But the good thing is most of the citizens pay their water bill. A lot of our decrease in revenue is usage. It's, some of the main users not using as much water. So I don't know exactly the extra number on delinquency, I'm sorry.
But it's not that significant.
No, it's not what's caused the big problem. I mean, it's up, but fairly, a lot of them have, I think, used their stimulus money to come in and pay the ones that's still here. We got, and we did set up a payment plan like the state said we needed to, so people coming in and paying, we gave them opportunity. We actually gave them 3 months longer or 4 months longer than we had to get things caught up before we started turning water off.
Anyone else? All right, I'll ask you to turn your attention to this appendix, appendix 2, which is a draft CIP plan for the water and sewer. Just as a reminder, the colors are the priorities, with red being the highest priority.
We have yellow.
That's wrong. Yeah, I got that wrong. No, so really the key on here is wrong. So red is the highest priority. Yellow is the second. Green is the third. Purple and blue are the lowest. Red I call comply with the big guy. Those are things that we have to do to stay in compliance with state and federal regulations, and keep the lights on. All right, so you can see the priority. I particularly want to draw your attention to the FY22 column above the double lines here. So sort of to this area that I'm pointing at here. That is the debt service that we have to pay in the current year.
Could you say that where that's at again? I'm sorry. Debt service.
About where I'm pointing.
Okay, gotcha.
In fact, I'll pull it up on the screen.
So red is the high priority.
Uh,